Hi, my name is David Saad and I'm the founder and CEO of Groupedia. What I would like to talk about today is venture capitalism. In light of what we've been witnessing on Wall Street, along with the melting down of our financial markets and the disappearance of IPOs with overreaching regulations such as Sarbanes-Oxley, yet on the other hand, bootstrapping is really igniting. We're finding that venture capitalism is actually morphing. So it's really time to reform venture capitalism, and specifically the interest of venture capitalists and their limited partners must be realigned with the interest of entrepreneurs. The business model, which is the blockbuster model, which is designed to produce home runs, must be changed. Transparency must be introduced, and accountability must be enforced, and also maybe some work ethics must be promoted within the venture capital community. So today it's a call for all constituents, namely the entrepreneurs who create value, the venture capitalists who manage funds, and the limited partners who invest in venture capital funds, to come together to find out how can venture capitalism be calibrated. For the record, by the way, I invited many venture capitalists, among which some of the top tier venture capital firms, to comment on this discussion, on this article, but no one took the invitation. So I guess one can say that their silence is deafening. But anyway, when a venture-backed company succeeds, everything is hunky-dory and everybody laughs all the way to the bank, even though some more than others. But nonetheless, everybody is happy. But it is really when a venture-backed company stagnates or fails when the problem starts. So the reality is that only a very tiny percentage of entrepreneurs have a good experience with venture capitalists, while all the rest, namely the companies that get rejected, the companies that get funded but stagnate, and those that get funded but fail, have a terrible experience with venture capitalists, and that need not to be the case. So this article is about presenting some of those experiences, and more specifically exposing some of the predatory practices that we've been seeing in venture capitalism. And all of that for the purpose of avoiding a meltdown in the venture capitalism market similar to what we've been now witnessing on Wall Street. So let's start with some basic principle. By the way, I have some of the very good friends of mine that are venture capitalists, and I hope that I'm not going to lose them after publishing this article. But nonetheless, today it's time for leadership and courage to come forward and point out some of the deficiencies that we are finding in venture capitalism. So it's really not about to rant, bash, or bitch against venture capitalists, but it's really about enhancing the system and making it better. So let's start with some basic principles on which we can start our discussion. Principle number one is that the discussion must be principled, must be based on principles, not on positions. Example of a principle would be equal pay for equal work. An example of a position is someone stands and say, I want X%. That's a position. The second principle is that rewards must be proportionate to the risks involved. So the higher the risk, the more rewards, and vice versa. Compensations must be commensurate with contributions. So the more one makes contribution, the higher the contribution, and vice versa. The fourth principle is one of fairness. Fairness must prevail at all times. A party who is in the driver's seat should not be taking advantage of his passengers. So that means that if one can do something, that doesn't mean that he should. And if things are the way they are, that doesn't mean that they should continue to be. So predatory type of practices must be condemned and prohibited. So let's turn our attention to what venture capitalism is all about and where we stand today. Venture capitalism was originally created to fund companies that were not able to get financing from banks and what have you in order to support their ventures. And the reason is because their ventures represent very high risk. So venture capitalists stepped in and started to fund those companies. And in fact, to be fair, venture capitalists brought in more than the capital that they had, and that is their experience in a particular industry along with their Rolodex and their contacts. So they do make substantial contribution to the success of ventures aside and in addition to the capital that they invest on behalf of the limited partners. But nowadays, venture capitalists rarely invest in early or seed or early stages. In fact, the great majority, if not all venture capitalists, have turned into private equity fund managers. Venture capitalism ought to be reserved to, in my opinion, venture capitalism ought to be reserved to seed or early stages type of companies. So if I may draw the line, I would draw the line at the Series B. So that means that anything that is before Series B would be considered as venture capital, and anything beyond Series B would be considered as a private equity capital. So also venture capitalists used to be highly experienced individuals in a particular industry. Those are entrepreneurs who set up their own companies, exited, and have succeeded in their profession. Nowadays, unfortunately, I might add, a lot of venture capitalists are attorneys or investment bankers or some kind of financial analyst with Ivy League MBAs. The problem, and none of them have really any operational or entrepreneurial experience within a particular industry. That is a little bit problematic. Aside the fact that some of those venture capitalists are quite a bit annoying to entrepreneurs, they misunderstand entrepreneurs and oftentimes mistreat entrepreneurs, and they are the ones who actually create bubbles because they don't invest, they speculate, or they hurt. And that is the problem. Also, venture capitalist is neither a legal nor a financial transaction. It's actually a business transaction for the purpose of commercializing a particular innovation. That's what venture capitalism is all about. But anyway, also it used to be that one becomes a venture capitalist at the end of his career, his or her career. Nowadays, we are seeing recent MBA graduates from Ivy League school becoming venture capitalists, and you go meet with them, and within 10 minutes of the meeting, they want to change your whole business model based on whatever idea that they recently read at Harvard Business Review, and then they decide to replace you at a time when you have not even decided to accept their money. So that's the kind of attitude that we are witnessing in venture capitalism, in the venture capital market. So just to put things into perspective, you wonder who needs who. Entrepreneurs, in fact, are the bloodstream of venture capitalism. And venture capitalists need entrepreneur a lot more than entrepreneurs need venture capitalists. And sure enough, there are a lot more bootstrapped rather than venture-backed companies that have succeeded, including the technology sector. So if anything, it's really the venture capitalists who really need good entrepreneurs versus good entrepreneurs who really need venture capitalists, even though venture capitalists try to create an impression that it's the other way around for self-fulfilling prophecy, if you wish. Let's turn our attention right now to the business model that is being used by venture capitalists. The business model is really a blockbuster model designed to produce home runs. It's a blue model where the winner take all. So any company that is not capable of being a home run or that it will be a home run it's not funded, and if it fails to show that it's going to be a home run, then it gets to be dumped or left to die. And the rationale behind this is that it takes a long time to nurture a venture. It takes as much time, if not more time, to manage a stagnated or failed company rather than a home run company. And it takes about 10 times the investment to make it worthwhile for the venture capitalist to engage. So put all that together, essentially in a very simplistic term, venture capitalists think of their business as being a hit and miss business. Well, who's hitting and who's missing? So if you really think about it, a successful entrepreneur who produced a blockbuster is getting penalized for his success to support all the failures that were caused by the venture capitalists. They are the ones who selected the wrong companies in the first place. So clearly the business model is wrong. Also, if you allow the model to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more tolerant, chances are that the companies that stagnate may have a chance to possibly become home runs. But because of the impatience and the intolerance of the system, those companies are dumped much quicker than they ought to be. So in a lot of ways, tolerance, which a lot of venture capitalists lack, is the very thing that they really need to produce blockbusters in a lot of ways. So by adjusting, I believe that by adjusting their model and their expectation and the return on their investment, I think we can have a much more fruitful and productive system that produces a higher quality and higher quantity of successful companies. So much for the business model. Let's now turn our attention to risks, and let's figure out who is taking risk and who is not. Well, entrepreneurs take a risk by investing their savings into their venture, obviously. The limited partners take risks, in fact, a lot of risk, the highest risk, by investing the most amount of money in the venture capital fund. So they take a lot of risk. What about venture capitalists? Do they take any risk? The answer is, to your surprise maybe, no. They don't take any risk. So unless the general partners of a venture capital firm invest from their own pocket in their own fund or in a venture, they don't take any risk whatsoever. So neither risking people's reputation or sweat equity or potential capital gains, those are all risks that cannot be claimed. And if they can be claimed, they can be claimed by all parties. So essentially the system is very simple. No money, no risk. Yet the compensation, as we will see, that venture capitalists earn is very disproportionate with the fact that they are not taking any risks. Furthermore, let me a little bit elaborate on the risk. There is an absolute risk, which is the absolute amount of money that is being invested. That's one. But then there is a relative risk, which is the ratio of the amount invested versus the asset held by a party. And let me give you an example. So let's say an entrepreneur who has a total asset of about $100,000 in cash and invests $80,000 in his venture. Well, that entrepreneur is taking 80% risk on his asset, while an investor who has $100 million in liquid asset, invests $10 million in a venture, $8 million in a venture, he is taking only 8% risk on his total asset. So while the investor has invested 100 times more than the entrepreneur has taken 10 times more relative risk than the investor. Of course, that's relatively speaking. And of course, I realize that it is very dicey and very difficult to figure out and to measure that relative risk. And even though it should be modest compared to the absolute risk, but it cannot be ignored. It should not be ignored. It is a risk. It's a relative risk that the entrepreneur is taking that should be accounted for in the formula. So now let's turn our attention to compensation, which is a very hot and sensitive topic. Limited partners, when they invest their money, they expect a very high return, typically about 3 times their money. Of course, they shoot for about 10 times to get the 3. So that translates into an IRR of about 30%, say. But that IRR, in my opinion, ought to be tied to the market conditions. So at a time when people were getting 20 to 30% on their money and investing in stocks and what have you, today nobody can park their money anywhere for more than 3%, if that. So getting, for example, an IRR of 15 or 20% would be absolutely great, considering the fact that you cannot get anything better than 3%. So the IRR rate ought to be proportionate to the market conditions. So let's now talk about the compensation of the venture capitalists. Venture capitalists have a compensation that consists of 2 parts. One is the administration fee that they charge the limited partners, and that consists of anywhere between 2 to 3%, so an average of 2.5% of the money raised. So on a $500 million fund, the venture capitalists take about $12.5 million per year for $125 million for a 10-year period, which is the typical life cycle of a fund, for covering their salaries, their overhead, their operational costs, etc. And that is not counting the interest made on that money. In addition, the venture capitalists earn a commission on the capital gain. So if the fund of 500, so 500 minus 125, that's 375 on that, 3 times the earning, that's about 1.1 billion, let's say, of capital gain. The commission on that the venture capitalists earn is about 20 to 25%, so let's call it 23%. So now the venture capitalists are earning about 258 million, according to my calculation, a commission on the total amount of capital gain that they have drawn from that total capital. So the total compensation of the venture capitalists is 258 of commission plus 125 for the administration fee. That's a total of about 383. So within a period of 10 years, the limited partners earned 866 million, while the venture capitalists earned 383 million. And that without the venture capitalists putting up any money of their own or taking any risk whatsoever. So, is that justified? Well, my theory is that it isn't. And here are the reasons why. First, venture capitalists are no longer in early and seed stages. Why should they get such high return? They are not taking much risk. So their return ought to be adjusted accordingly. So the earlier the stage, the higher the risk, the more return. Logical. Second, venture capitalists are not putting their own money. So as I said, no money, no risk. And the compensation ought to be proportionate. So why, if you compare, for example, investment bankers, the typical interest or commission that an investment bankers make is about 6%. Venture capitalists are earning a commission of about 23%. So why such discrepancy? Sure, venture capitalists put a lot of effort. They handhold the entrepreneurs. They put a lot of their expertise and their contacts. But is it 6 times, 10 times more? That's questionable. Aside, there is nothing that the venture capitalists do that is either unique or irreplaceable. So, for example, if a entrepreneur decides, let's suppose it is feasible for an entrepreneur to hire an investment banker at 6%, raise the money, and hire all the possible experts in the world to do the same functions that the venture capitalists do, that entrepreneur will end up saving a lot more money. So So the fee, the commission that venture capitalists earn on the capital gain is way, way too high, and it must be adjusted. So let's now talk about accountability. Of course, when a venture succeeds, everybody benefits, including the venture capitalists, and they ought to do that. And the reason is because they put a lot of effort. And by all means, I'm not trying to minimize the effort that venture capitalists put into their ventures. They do select ventures. They take the time to do their due diligence. They sit on boards where they just not give their advice or govern, but they are involved in strategizing, planning, recruiting, even executing at a time when there is certain gaps in the management team. So sure enough, venture capitalists, at least the good ones, put quite a bit of effort, and they deserve to be compensated. But the question is their compensation fair? And two, are they accountable to their failures? So what happens when a venture fails? In my opinion, venture capitalists are having the cake and eat it too. They get rewarded for success, and they walk away scot-free when things go south. And that is simply unacceptable. You're either involved or you're not involved. If you are involved, you must be accountable. And if you're not involved, you must get out of the kitchen, which means that maybe you ought not to sit on the board. The fact of the matter is that venture capitalists are intimately involved in the operation of their ventures, and they must be held accountable for any of their failures. So who must hold the venture capitalists accountable? The limited partners are not really qualified to do so, and besides, the limited partners really don't care if a particular venture fails. All what they care about is their IRR. So if the totality of the fund produces the return that they expect, everything is great. And so as for the venture capitalists. So they are really not worried about a particular venture, but rather the totality of the fund. What about the entrepreneurs? Can the entrepreneurs hold venture capitalists accountable? The answer is no. And the reason is because of the type of agreements that the venture capitalists managed to put in front of the entrepreneurs. In conclusion, the venture capitalists have a huge upside and no downside, and they don't take any risk whatsoever because they don't invest any of their money, and that ought not to be the case, and it should change, and there should be no more free lunch. So let's turn our attention to the predatory practices. The first example is the liquidation rights. So let me give you an example. A venture capitalist invests, let's say, $10 million in a company. And the entrepreneur performs very, very well, and everybody is happy. Yet, the overall climate is such that the valuations of companies are going down. And so the venture capitalists come in and they decide that it's better to have one bird in the hand rather than 10 on the tree, and they decide to exit by selling the company for $30 million. But their liquidation rights allows them to take 3 times their money before anybody gets anything. And that is not uncommon. So essentially, on the other hand, by the way, the entrepreneur doesn't want to sell. And the reason is because he's performing well. He thinks that he can weather the storm, that if he waits and continues to perform, he will be able to increase the valuation of the company. He has no motivation of selling right now. But too bad for the entrepreneur. The venture capitalists force their hand and sell the company for $30 million. So what happens now is that the venture capitalist gets $30 million, and the entrepreneur gets nothing, nada, zip. So that means that the entrepreneur puts all that effort, invented whatever he invented, works so hard, get mortgage to the tilt, and get nothing. Actually, he may get his divorce papers. So that's one particular case. The second case is the dilution rights. So let me give you an example. A savvy and experienced entrepreneur disagrees with the venture capitalist. on the direction of the company. The venture capitalists decide to dump him, so they fire him, and they replace the entrepreneur by a CEO who fails. So in order for the company to survive, there is another round, which happens to be a down round. And that down round essentially wipes out the original entrepreneur and keeps the shares or the percentage of the shares of the venture capitalist intact. So essentially, the venture capitalists have enriched themselves on the back and on the expense of the entrepreneur, while in fact they have failed because they have replaced them by somebody who's really incompetent. So who should pay for that failure? And in fact, the venture capitalist. But in fact, the venture capitalist is enriching himself rather than paying for that failure. And it is really the entrepreneur who's paying for that mistake. What about the vesting period? Let's take a look at that. So an entrepreneur who invests $1 million of his own money in his venture goes out and produces a product that starts to get some traction. So, but he needs an additional $1 million, let's say, to get some market validation. So he goes out and is successful in raising $1 million from some kind of a boutique venture capital firm who puts in about $1 million. So now you've got a entrepreneur who puts in $1 million and a venture capitalist who puts $1 million. The venture capitalist comes in and asks the entrepreneur, or rather insists, on having the stock of the entrepreneur put in escrow, and that 75% of that stock be vested in a 3-year period. And the rationale is that the venture capitalist wants to keep the entrepreneur motivated to keep working and slaving away at the venture. So, well, on the surface that sounds fair, but wait a minute. What about vesting the stock of the venture capitalist? After all, the venture capitalist is promising that he's going to use his Rolodex, that he's going to strategize, plan, bring in customers, blah, blah, blah. But what if he doesn't? What if he's either incapable or unwilling to provide all those added value that justify the return? Shouldn't the stock of the shares of the venture capitalists be vested very similarly to the entrepreneur? Absolutely. But essentially what the venture capitalist is saying, my $1 million is greener than your $1 million. Yet, if there is any dollar that should be any greener than the other, it should really be the dollar of the entrepreneur who invested first and took a lot more risk. That's the dollar that ought to be greener. Yet, the venture capitalists, again, get away with murder. So, and finally, let's talk about closing costs. Now, that is the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard. And that is that the venture capitalists insist on having the entrepreneur pay for the entrepreneur's legal expenses as well as the venture capitalist's legal expenses. And I wonder, what's the logic behind that? Why is the entrepreneur should pay for the legal expenses of the venture capitalist? That ought to be the cost of doing business. After all, the venture capitalist is charging the limited partners 2%, representing $12 million per year for that expense. So I think that the venture capitalist here is really milking it. Besides, this whole closing cost ought to basically disappear. And the reason is because we ought to eliminate attorneys. After all, if you really think about it, we now have all the possible combination and permutation of different clauses imaginable for any kind of business in any kind of industry. So if we list all those contracts, put them up on LegalZoom or on God knows Docs Talk, you will be able to get them at $10 a piece or for free. We really don't need to maintain those Taj Mahals of attorneys. So let's eliminate those closing costs for entrepreneurs, and that would be great. Finally, actually, the mindset. Let's take a look at the mindset. The mindset of venture capitalists is very, very different than the mindset of the entrepreneurs. To start with, venture capitalists and limited partners are very well equipped and trained to deal with failures, unlike the entrepreneur. The whole blockbuster model is based on producing many failures. So it is very accustomed and usual and customary that a portfolio of a venture capitalist includes many, many failures and a couple of home runs. And that is acceptable. And if that were to be the case, venture capitalists consider themselves as being a great success if they have many failures but one huge success. That's quite all right. So they are very equipped in dealing with failures. Not so for the entrepreneurs. The entrepreneur, what he's dealing with is one and only one venture. He has made all the kind of sacrifices. He has put a lot of money, used his credit card, mortgaged his house, took a lot of risk, and is very passionate and in love with his venture. If that venture fails, it's devastating. It's devastating emotionally, it's devastating personally, career-wise, professionally. Everything about the failure is devastating for the entrepreneur. He's putting all his eggs in that one and single one basket. The venture capitalists are extremely insensitive to that. They just think that the entrepreneurs ought to walk away and go to the next thing. Well, that's very easy said than done. So there's indeed a huge chasm, if you wish, between the mindset of the entrepreneur and the mindset of venture capitalists that ought to be addressed. How about ethics? Well, that is something that I am particularly very sensitive to. Apparently, in order to become venture capitalist, one has to graduate from a course called Irresponsiveness 101. What it means is this, is that venture capitalists are like black holes. They lack basic courtesy and professionalism. Let me give you an analogy. If sales representatives were to treat their customers the way venture capitalists treat entrepreneurs, they ought to all be fired. The sad part is that venture capitalists know about their misbehavior, yet they continue to do so because maybe they think that it is very cool to have a whole bunch of entrepreneurs running after them. Maybe that boosts their ego or something. But it's really very sad because even though we know that the venture capitalists have the upper hand, that doesn't mean that they ought to be abusive. Real powerful leaders don't abuse their power. Real wealthy individuals don't show off and shove their wealth through the throat of people. It's a nouveau riche type of attitude that got to go, and it's getting old. So also, the minute a venture capitalist opened his doors, he has the duty to respond to each and every single inquiry, regardless of how many inquiries there are. And that reminds me of good employers. Good employers respond to each and every employment application. And the reason is because their reputation is on the line. And they do it in a very timely and prompt manner. And I believe that the venture capitalists ought to establish systems in their organization to address this issue and respond to entrepreneurs in a very timely fashion. And a good article on that is an article that I have published called The Art of Rejection that could be a good reading for those who are interested. And also, other than collecting statistics, maybe the Venture Capital Association ought to come up with a code of conduct that could be imposed on venture capitalists and come up maybe with a newsletter with a list of venture capitalists who basically breach that code. Kind of like a little bit similar to a review website called The Funded, or a list of disbarred attorneys, if you wish. Anyway, finally, let me talk about regulations. Personally, I like free market, and I think that venture capitalism ought to work in a free market, open free market. However, the track record right now is not very positive. And very unfortunately, we no longer live under normal circumstances where we can let the venture capitalism on its own in a free market. We face global competition, and we have an astronomical debt with unprecedented trade deficit. All our manufacturing is now outsourced to Asia, and all what we got left is really our entrepreneurial spirit and our entrepreneurship. So I believe that entrepreneurship must be raised to the level of national security and must be addressed appropriately. While overall, venture capitalists have made substantial contribution to the industry and made quite a bit of effort in doing so, there has been quite a bit of abuse, especially in the area of behavior, of compensation, and predatorial type of practices. And all that needs to be addressed. I believe that the venture capitalists, like any other profession, ought to be licensed and regulated. So, in conclusion, I think that there ought to be some, let's say, let me call it venture capitalism 2.0, which is a more compassionate, more tolerant, more transparent, more ethical, and more equitable and accountable type of venture capitalism. And I hope that venture capitalists, as well as entrepreneurs, take the time to give me their thoughts. Thank you.